Okay, so the trauma theory risks and triggers, this will feel like an overview for you. But because we're recording it for some other people who hopefully will stop by at a later time period, we'll just go through it. But please, if you have any questions about how you might translate some of this with staff that you're working with, I would love to talk about that as well. Okay, so trauma has two components. The first being an intensive event that is either experienced or witnessed, and that leads to reactions that persist and affect daily lives after the event has ended. So this is a very broad definition that allows for, the point is not to say it's a very specific thing that is kind of like alienating for those that are having trauma like responses. We want to make sure that it just makes sense and that something is going on, they've witnessed or experienced it, and then there's some sort of outcome that's impacting their functioning. So again, experiencing a trauma does not necessarily lead to having trauma, or an event that's traumatic does not mean that they will have trauma. So if you think about the ways in which all of us have specific experiences that have aversive like impacts, and we recall them and they're terrible memories, but some of us have managed to not have that impact our daily functioning. And however, trauma is reflective of students who do have an impact of their functioning that persists. Did you have a question, or it sounded like you might have had a comment?
Oh, sorry, I just had a student that popped in, so I muted myself, but I'll keep muting myself so you can film.
No worries. Okay, so in terms of the types of trauma that we kind of think about are natural disasters, accidents, sexual abuse, loss, traumatic grief, domestic violence, medical injury, illness or procedures, community violence, school violence, neglect, a kidnapping. So these are some of the very common instances that we consider to be traumatic events. So how common is this? In terms of natural disasters, 1 in 3 have been involved or in a way that they feared for their own lives. About 18% of children and adolescents have lost someone to homicide. And 6% of children have experienced sexual traumatization within the past year. And among later adolescent females, 14 to 17, 23% have stated experiencing this within the last year. And 38% have experienced community violence, 9% for domestic, and in my mind, a pretty high percentage of children and adolescents have stated that they've experienced physical assaults. So 71% of those have stated that. And to me, a shocking amount, 17% have stated experiencing extreme physical assault. It's important to remember that these are reported numbers and not actual, meaning that these are based off of national surveys that were conducted, and that many students often do not share those experiences. So it means that there's an underreporting. So we might think that these numbers are actually significantly higher than this because there are those that aren't sharing those experiences. So in terms of trauma triggers, a trigger is a way in which we are reminded of that traumatic event. And there are 2 forms: external, and these would be situations, people, or places. And for internal, it's the thoughts and memories and emotions and bodily sensations. So internal experiences that remind us of the traumatic event, and external are the circumstances outside of us that remind us. Some examples of these are an argument, certain smells, holidays, and people who resemble the ones involved with the traumatic event. And we also, in terms of internal, might see this as experiencing anger, anxiety, and sadness, or pain and muscle tension, or a racing heartbeat. For emotions, it's common to experience feeling abandoned or lonely, out of control, and vulnerable as triggers. So situations that lead to those feelings might be a moment where they are reminded of the traumatic event. Now, for you having working as a social worker, have you noticed any specific circumstances of triggers that have come up?
I'm like a lot of that external situations. And those like emotions, anger, anxiety, sadness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And with children, they're not always very aware of this is what's going on. This is essentially, you're kind of asking them like, oh, I noticed that you're upset or you're crying or you're angry. And they really aren't able to kind of connect the dots between a moment of triggering and then the way that they're expressing it emotionally or physically in their behaviors. Conceptually, this is what might be going on, but our children, especially with the age that you're describing, K through 6, they really don't have the ability to say, I'm feeling triggered and it's because someone's wearing this perfume, or I feel lonely. And that's the tricky part.
Definitely.
So I just wanted to go over this piece. So what happens after a trigger? So you might have a student in class and everything's going okay. And they might have a smell or sit there and think about something that reminds them, or they hear a sound and it leads to a trigger, meaning the moment in which they are reminded. Now, this might not be might not be they're literally remembering a memory, but it might be something like hearing a pop or someone yell in class is triggering, and that then means that internally they experience racing heartbeat or feeling uncomfortable or a sense of fear, and that leads to this agitation stage. And that's when we might not even catch it at this point until there's some sort of acceleration. So they might start crying, or you might notice behavioral disruptions. Then they hit this peak. That looks very different based off of each student and the ways in which they are like exhibiting triggers. Afterwards, there's that de-escalation, meaning a period when they calm down and come back to baseline or recovery. Now, this process is very different for each student in terms of how it happens and how long they take for each step. I think for you, this would be really, and I didn't ask for your first name. What's your first name?
It's Kathy.
Kathy. So maybe for you, when you're working with teachers, it would be very helpful to go over this escalation cycle so they can kind of pick up on points in which they could intervene. So trying to be as aware as possible of when there might be some sort of agitation, because it's much easier to do something about this at number 3 than over at number 5. Right?
Yeah.
Or helping them know that when someone's at their peak, that's not really a place for them to intervene either.
Definitely.
Meaning that at our peak, that's when we're most activated and emotionally engaged, that it's very difficult to hear or see anything because the triggering, it activates our fight or flight response. And if people can think of a time when they were truly afraid, you don't remember things, you're not functioning in the same way, and so that's what's happening with our students too. So in terms of the aftermath, once they've come down, you might notice that there's fatigue or feeling tired and hungry and thirsty and feeling kind of uncomfortable, which leads to restlessness. And they might also have nightmares back at home. So you might hear teachers mention being told by parents that they aren't sleeping too well, or you might notice them mentioning those sorts of things. One of the things I think is important to think about is how can we tell the difference between trauma and behavioral concerns? What do you think, Kathy?
That was my very question I was thinking when I was looking at that escalation cycle. Because in some ways, like, they're so intertwined, you know, because you still have to have, like, you would do interventions for both, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's the point I want to make. You really can't tell from a surface level the difference between a student who's experiencing a traumatic trigger and has a behavioral concern that's not a result of trauma. I think that's important for our teachers and our staff to be aware of, is that you might see a kid really struggling, and it's not necessarily that they're that they're having difficulties behaviorally, but it might be something completely different. And so knowing that we can't tell the difference until we hear more information, we should really just try our best to respond in the moment without making too many decisions just yet about what is the source of this behavior. Any questions or thoughts so far?
No, not yet.
Okay, perfect.